From Washington, D.C., I'm Allister D'Souza. This is Washington Watch, a weekly roundup of the biggest stories from the United States and beyond. A massive victory for the Trump administration. The Supreme Court has issued a partial ban on birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court did not, however, make any decision on if Trump's move to end birthright citizenship is unconstitutional. Administration insists Iran's nuclear program has been obliterated, derailed by decades, but a leaked Pentagon report says otherwise. President Trump says U.S.-Iran talks could resume next week. Iran's foreign minister says Tehran has no such plans.
President Trump created the conditions to end the war, decimating, choose your word, obliterating, destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities.
In an exclusive interview to NDTV, U.S. Congressman Ami Bera says he does not think U.S. strikes on Iran set back Tehran's nuclear program by decades. Bera is a member of the U.S. House Intelligence Committee.
Whether it was set back months or years, I don't think it was set back decades. Let's put it that way.
President Trump hints at a very big trade deal coming up with India. New Delhi has been in talks with Washington to avoid hefty U.S. tariffs that could be slapped onto Indian goods in about 10 days. Meanwhile, without providing any sort of details, Trump says a trade deal with China has already been signed.
Having some great deals. We have one coming up, maybe with India, very big one, where we're going to open up India.
And a scramble in the Senate by Republicans looking to pass Trump's big, beautiful bill. Things have stalled after parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough said that the bill violates rules. McDonough has objected to cuts on health benefits and other things. Some Republicans are calling for her to be fired or be ignored, going against what's usually been the norm. All right, in breaking news that's just come in the last 20 minutes or half an hour, so critical U.S. Supreme Court ruling which grants a partial ban on birthright citizenship. The latest Supreme Court ruling is, remember, not a decision on whether Trump has the authority to end birthright citizenship. It made no mention of that or ruled on that. Rather, it's instead a ruling about how whether lower courts have that power to stop Trump from implementing his ban on birthright citizenship across the United States. Now, the Supreme Court has said that, issued that ruling that limits really those powers, that injunction power. Now, just for some background here, 3 lower courts stopped Trump's plans with a nationwide injunction. The Trump administration then went to the Supreme Court saying that lower courts can't issue blanket nationwide bans. Now, birthright citizenship means that every child born in the United States automatically becomes a U.S. citizen, irrespective of the parent's nationality. Trump, of course, wanting to end birthright citizenship and putting in an executive order on that front. Let's try and get more on the story, try and understand what exactly the Supreme Court has said. For more on this breaking story, I'm joined by Hiba Anver. She's an attorney at Erickson Immigration Group in Arlington, Virginia. Hiba, thank you so much for joining us here on NDTV. If you could tell us exactly, what does the Supreme Court say about injunctions?
So essentially, the Supreme Court held that a federal judge's ability to issue a nationwide injunction was no longer as expansive as it has been in the past. In other words, basically, the Supreme Court narrowed the scope of nationwide injunctions that are imposed by judges so that the injunctions now only apply to an individual or a group or a state that sues. So in other words, if you apply this ruling to the executive order on birthright citizenship, it basically means that the birthright citizenship executive order can move forward in states, even if the state has challenged it to a certain extent, depending on whether or not an individual or a group sues.
So just for a hypothetical understanding of this, if there was an Indian couple that sued against Trump's order, then they would essentially be protected. These are Indian couples who would be here on a temporary work permit, for example, but that would not necessarily apply to everyone else who are not part of that lawsuit. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I think the operative words here are if the couple chooses to sue and if they're ultimately successful. What the concern as a result of this ruling is that this is now going to create a situation where individual couples or individuals or groups have to engage in individualized litigation, as opposed to the ability of a federal judge issuing a nationwide universal injunction and stopping something that the judge feels is unconstitutional through one limited action. So I think the best illustration of that would be if you think about an H-1B visa holder in the US who happens to be pregnant. If the pregnant H-1B visa holder wants to challenge the birthright citizenship executive order, she would actually have to sue individually or join a class action.
But Hiba, wouldn't that create a lot of confusion across the United States with all these individual cases, either individually or class action?
That's definitely one of the concerns. The scenario that is potentially created now is significant logistical administrative burden, as well as, quite honestly, additional bureaucratic burden on the part of the government, because now the government has to go through additional steps in order to verify, the citizenship of the child that's born in the United States. If there's going to be a set of parents who are claiming birthright citizenship for their child, there's going to be additional documentation or information that now needs to be provided, but also subsequently verified. So there is definitely potential for quite a bit more burdensome administrative, but also bureaucratic burden.
Right. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here and sifting through these details that have just come in, giving us clarity on that as well. Now, let's get across to Raymond Victory. He's represents the Democratic side of things. Raymond, you've heard that. You've heard what's come in from the Supreme Court. Your immediate reactions to what you've heard?
Well, thanks very much for having me. My immediate reaction is that this is of a piece of President Trump's attempt to change the constitutional method of government in the United States. We've had a system of checks and balances for almost 250 years, and that is that the executive is not supreme, but is constrained by the judicial branch and the legislative branch. President Trump obviously wants to change that. He wants to make it more of an authoritarian approach to government. So one of the ways in which you do that is to attack the courts. You attack the courts on decisions that you want to try to weaken their powers. The 14th Amendment, which requires birthright citizenship, is plain in the United States Constitution. The Supreme Court did not have the chutzpah, if you will, gumption, to try to attack that directly. So what they've done is to try to attack it indirectly and to weaken the power of the courts through this decision. It is of a piece of what the majority conservatives are willing to do, and that is to try to placate Trump and his administration around the edges procedurally while not taking on the obvious substantive question.
Raymond, thank you for your reactions there. We also would like to get some sort of reaction coming in from the Republican side of things. We have Puneet Ahluwalia joining us now. He represents the Republican Party. He's a Republican strategist. Puneet, clearly the Democrats unhappy about this, seeing this as a big blow. And surely you see this as a huge step forward for Trump, especially with those numerous injunctions that have come, not just on birthright citizenship, but in other things as well. For example, Trump's immigration crackdown.
Well, I'm glad President Trump has this victory. It's needed because what he's trying to do is really bring the rule of law, especially when it comes to immigration, which is one of the biggest mandates he got from the American voters, is to set that right. So he's trying to fix the issue, which has been done, should have been done by former presidents and the Congress, which they failed to do. Hence the reason we have a chaos in immigration in our country. But I'm glad President Trump and the Supreme Court sees it that way, and of course has kind of curtailed the power of the smaller courts. I think the Democrats tend to use the Constitution to their advantage. When it comes to Second Amendment, they're against it. When it comes to finding a path of rule of law and legal immigration in this nation, which is through the pathway and not creating a chaos, which has been created by the Biden and the Obama administration earlier, which has led us to this stage where President Trump is realigning the immigration process in our nation. So I believe that it's the right move. It's important for us to fix our immigration. At the same time, send the criminals, most importantly, what he's also trying to achieve is send the criminals back to the countries from where they've come from. If we can't send them back to those countries, we can send them somewhere else. But get the bad element out of our communities, out of our businesses, out of our families, and make America safe again.
Right, Puneet. Puneet, thank you very much for your time. Running out of time here on Washington Watch. The story is not going to go away anytime soon. Huge implications with that ruling coming in from the Supreme Court, and we'll continue to keep tabs on that. In other news now, the week began with the US bombing Iran's nuclear facilities, but now the US is aiming for talks with Iran. Iran's foreign minister, though, has put an spanner in the works, saying that no immediate negotiations are on the table as of now. Meanwhile, a ceasefire brokered by President Trump between Iran and Israel continues to hold. Israel's attack has left Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs damaged, but Tehran's regime continues to stand. As far as the path ahead, President Trump had earlier said that talks with Tehran are possible as early as next week, but Iran says that's certainly not the case.
I'll tell you what, look, we're going to talk to them next week with Iran. We may sign an agreement. I don't know. To me, I don't think it's that necessary. I mean, they had a war, they fought. Now they're going back to their world. I don't care if I have an agreement or not.
نه هیچ توافقی الان برای شروع مجدد مذاکره صورت نگرفت. من به صراحت عرض می‌کنم نه قراری گذاشته شده، نه قولی گذاشته شده، نه اصلا صحبتی ما کردیم برای شروع مجدد مذاکره.
All right, let's get you more on what's next between the United States and Iran. We're joined by Nicholas Hopton, who has served as British ambassador to Iran and other Middle East countries. Ambassador Hopton, thank you very much for your time here on Washington Watch. Now, if these talks happen, I understand that Iran, of course, clearly saying, as we mentioned earlier, that these talks are not likely, at least not next week, but Trump saying otherwise. So if these talks were to happen, who would exactly have the upper hand?
Well, obviously the US is in a very strong position. The Iranians welcomed the ceasefire. I think they were in a position where the conflict was not going their way. And maybe on the Israeli side, the ceasefire was slightly less welcome because they hadn't achieved any of the stated objectives that Prime Minister Netanyahu had set out for the Israeli action. I think the US, having brokered that ceasefire, having with Qatari help, obviously, and others helping to create that choreographed denouement, which allowed both sides to accept a ceasefire on Monday night. Well, I think the US is in a strong position. But at the same time, the Iranians will feel that they still have enough to negotiate with.
Ambassador Hopton, CNN source-based report says that the US is offering several incentives so Iran does negotiate, for example, a civilian nuclear program for energy usage that could be funded by Arab countries. There's also talk of the US easing sanctions. In your opinion, what's going to really do it for Tehran to come to the table?
Well, the primary objective for the Islamic regime is always its own survival. So negotiating a deal which will be achieved between the US and the Islamic Republic essentially gives some support to the existence of the continued existence of the Islamic Republic. So that's one incentive. A further incentive is, of course, it removes the immediate threat of a resumption of hostilities. And we saw how the Israeli and then with the US support side was so much stronger than anything the Iranians could put together. And they in Tehran and in Iran, I think Iranians have been a bit shocked by the vulnerability and the weakness of their lack of air defenses, and their military might was seen to be a bit of a paper tiger in comparison to the might of Israel and the US. So I think the Iranians will be looking for a deal which supports the continued existence of the regime. They will be prepared to pay a price for that, I would imagine. And of course, they will want to see an easing of sanctions, which will allow their economy to develop again, to trade with not only with those countries like China, to whom they're selling already a lot of oil, but with other countries in Asia, Europe, and possibly, if the deal develops in the way it seemed to be shaping up to before this latest conflict, there might be the lifting of primary sanctions in the US if President Trump is able to get that through the US Congress.
Right, now you've been a diplomat in the Middle East for several years. The question here is, who is really best placed to bring about lasting or at least some sort of stability in the region at this point in time?
Well, I think the US has just demonstrated that they do. They remain the world's only real superpower. They do need to work well with their partners, and that hasn't always been the case under President Trump's administration. But I'm very pleased to see the outcome of the NATO summit this week, which seems to demonstrate renewed US engagement with its closest partners, including the United Kingdom. And my hope is that this now is the beginning of a new phase where we will see a much more cooperative partnership approach coming out of the White House than we have seen at times, perhaps over the last few months, less confrontational, more facing challenges together, including in the Middle East. But at the end of the day, we need US leadership, strong, consistent US leadership. And I think countries in the Middle East would welcome that too, so that we can stabilize the region. And that will be good for the people of the Middle East, all the countries there, but also for the rest of the world as well.
Nicholas Hopton, thank you very much indeed. That was the former ambassador to Iran from the United Kingdom. Now, an uproar over the exact damage on Iran's nuclear capabilities continues. A leaked intelligence report from the Pentagon says that the US bombing of 3 key Iranian nuclear sites did not go far enough. It says that the damage caused only puts back Iran's nuclear program by months. President Trump says it's been put back by decades. Now, Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and CIA head John Ratcliffe say that the targeted sites have been destroyed. A similar sentiment echoed by the US Secretary of Defense as well. Now, in related news, President Trump came down hard on media outlets that ran stories about a leaked Pentagon report which said that US military action only set back Iran's nuclear program by a few months. Trump has insisted, like we mentioned, that it's been obliterated.
They flew 36 hours through enemy skies, dropped bunker busters on Iran's nuclear sites, and returned home to headlines questioning their mission's success. That's what got US President Donald Trump fired up this week.
I just want to thank our pilots. You know, they were maligned and treated very bad, demeaned by fake news.
On his Truth Social, Trump went ballistic, defending the pilots, slamming the Western media, and accusing them of trying to undercut a mission he calls legendary.
There was CNN, there was the New York Times, and they're both disgusting, really horrible groups of people.
He claims CNN and the New York Times lied and totally misrepresented the facts just to demean him.
CNN, which is back there, believe it or not, wasting time. And the New York Times, they put out a story that, well, maybe they were hit, but it wasn't bad. Well, it was so bad that they ended the war. It ended the war.
But behind Trump's anger lies another brewing storm, an intelligence report leak. Here's the rub. Leaked assessments suggest the strikes only temporarily set back Iran's nuclear program, despite more than a dozen precision-guided bunker busters. CNN reported that key centrifuges and enriched uranium may have been moved before impact.
They want to spin it to try to make him look bad based on a leak. So if you want to make an assessment of what happened at Fordo, you better get a big shovel and go really deep, because Iran's nuclear program is obliterated. Those that dropped the bombs precisely in the right place know exactly what happened when that exploded.
U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed an internal probe is underway to trace the source of a leaked Pentagon report, one that questions just how effective the Iran strikes really were. From Secretary of State Marco Rubio to Intel Chief Tulsi Gabbard to Middle East Envoy Steve Witkoff, Team MAGA is calling it media propaganda. Still, intelligence insiders caution Iran's nuclear rebuild may only be months, not years away. For now, the battle over the truth is just as fierce as the one in the skies over Iran. Rhythm Arcadia's report for NDTV World.
Let's try and get you more on that pressing question. What exactly has been the damage of Iran's nuclear capabilities? U.S. Congressman Ami Bera is a member of the U.S. House Intelligence Committee. He sat down with NDTV for an exclusive interview. Leaked intelligence reports from the Pentagon say that the strikes by the United States military was not as successful as portrayed. President Trump insists that Iran's nuclear program has been obliterated, put back by several decades, but that leak report in fact says that it's just been put back a few years. Which version are you buying?
Well, so I think this is why it's important for the administration to come to Congress, to the full Congress, House and Senate, and explain their side of things, the information that they have, what they're looking at. Obviously, I'm on the Intelligence Committee, so I have access to information that others don't have, so I won't go into details here. It's somewhere in between there. I do think there was some effectiveness on the strikes, but you know, if the real effectiveness is getting around to the negotiating table, if the ceasefire can hold, then perhaps it's irrelevant how far back the program was set, but rather have we created the context for negotiation.
If you're saying that we're somewhere in between, are we then likely to see further military action from the United States?
You know, these are all questions that we have for President Trump, for his administration. You know, what's the strategy here? Again, if the strategy was to do some direct strikes, whether it was set back months or years, I don't think it was set back decades, let's put it that way. If the goal, though, was to get around to the negotiating table, then, you know, it may still effectively achieve what you set out to do. So, I mean, this is a tenuous ceasefire. Both Iran and Israel are declaring victory. At this juncture, let's broker, perhaps with some of the Gulf states, you know, a conversation, a negotiation. I know the Qataris are, you know, doing some negotiation as well. Again, is there a possibility for a long-term solution in the Middle East?
We've also heard reports about how Iran may have potentially moved its enriched uranium to a safe location, also centrifuges, equipment needed to make their nuclear weapon. So if that's the scenario, then wouldn't it logically be a case where the United States might need to pursue further military action?
You know, again, I think those are all questions that if there's going to be additional military action, I do think the president has to come to Congress, right? You know, we have the War Powers Act. Is there unless there's an imminent threat to the United States, which right now it does not seem there's an imminent threat to the United States or our personnel, then we do think the president needs to come to Congress and we need to give them those authorizations.
U.S. Democratic Congressman Ami Bera there talking to NDTV. And before we wrap up, let's get you this last story. It was a handshake showdown, and perhaps for once, Donald Trump didn't have the upper hand. Known for his assertive grip, the U.S. president met his match with the Dutch king. The monarch offered a 10-second-long power shake mirroring Trump's own signature move. The moment's gone viral, with many calling it the ultimate handshake reversal. And that's all we have time for here on Washington Watch. Thank you for your company.